For more on the U.S. China trade negotiations, let's bring in former Commerce Secretary Carlos Gutierrez, who served under President George W. Bush. He's the chairman of Albright Stonebridge Group. And Carlos, thank you for being with us.
Pleasure, Becky. Thank you.
What do you think about where we stand? I hadn't realized that last point that Kayla made, that there would have to be some notification today in order to put off those tariffs from taking place on Sunday.
Well, look, I think that the announcements over the last couple of days, especially coming out of the U.S., are positive. This doesn't mean that the trade war will be over, but it's a halt. It's a halt in hostilities. And I think what's remarkable is that we have announced that we are willing to take down tariffs, not only stop the increase on the 15th, but actually take down some of the tariffs that we've already put on. That's an extraordinary concession. I think it's a sign of goodwill on our part. But now we have to wait for China. My understanding is that what they're pushing back on is we want a specific number for purchases, soybeans, et cetera, and they're not willing to commit to a specific number. And also, we don't know what's in the section of IP and technology transfer and all these structural issues that really are the core of the relationship and what we should be focused on. So there's still a lot to learn. And of course, we have to hear from China. We haven't heard from their side yet.
Mr. Secretary, the way you've laid it out, the deal keeps getting skinnier and skinnier. We've basically whittled this down to what sounds like an ag purchase deal, and now we have questions about how much how much of the agricultural products they'd be willing to bet on. What would you suggest doing at this point? Maybe we go ahead with this deal and hope for further talks to come with phase 2 and phase 3 beyond?
Yeah, I think if we can get phase 1 deal, which essentially will be kind of halting hostilities, it's not going to be a major breakthrough, and give us a little bit of time to assess our goals. What are we trying to do? It's interesting, our trade deficit, which was the original idea with China, is leveling out. It has begun to narrow. Which is good, but with the rest of the world, it's growing, which means that a lot of the production is just moving out of China to other places. I think we should turn our attention to technology, to the future. A cyber agreement between the U.S. and China, I think, would be the best news for the markets, and it would be real, because that is the issue. It's not about soybean purchases in the future. That tends to be very tactical, just kind of mercantilist. We need to be focused on the structural issues, especially on technology. And I hope that the administration sets its sights that way in round 2.
A cyber agreement that says what? Because that sounds pretty tricky.
Well, how is China going to regulate its market? Is it still going to, the China 2025 is something they don't talk about anymore. It's something that apparently they've walked away from. But China 2025 essentially was a decoupling of technology, trying to decouple China from the U.S., from the West on technology. I think that would be a major problem for China, a major problem for us, a major problem for the world. Everyone is going their own way. The European Union has GDPR. India has its own scheme, China, Vietnam. So the world is splintering when it comes to technology, which means we're not going to get the benefits. And then, of course, the technology transfer. I do think that there's a little bit more leverage now because now China has some of their own technology that they want to protect, whether it's Huawei or Tencent or anyone else. So, but that's the big issue, and I think
it's a big issue, but I think that's an intractable issue too, Mr. Secretary.
It's a long term.
Because of security concerns that are now there and that have been raised, and even if there is an agreement reached on trade, you talk to somebody like the Ajit Pai, the head of the FCC. He wants to see Chinese-made equipment from Huawei and ZTE and others no longer being put into rural equipment here in the rural communication companies here in the United States. They're saying the same thing in China, that they don't want U.S.-made equipment or foreign-made equipment put into their state enterprises. You're talking about a serious separation that has been exaggerated or is going to be really kind of pushed into a much firmer place over the next many months.
I think you're absolutely right, Becky. Negotiating a cyber agreement with China is going to be a lot more complicated than negotiating soybeans. But what choice do we have? I think we have to give it a shot, and we have to give it a shot with our partners. You know, up until now with our allies, European Union, Japan, others, it seems that our policy has been to stop China from achieving their strategy. So we're trying to convince countries don't get involved in Belt and Road, but they continue to get involved. We're trying to convince countries not to buy Huawei, but we just saw Germany signed a deal with Huawei to help Germany build out their 5G network. So I think instead of trying to stop China, we should have our own strategy. And how are we going to compete in the future? It's not about bringing back jobs. It's about creating new jobs in new industries.
Mr. Secretary, these are all the allies that people that criticize the way we're approaching China. These are all the allies that they're saying we should be working with to work together, and we're doing it all wrong. These are the crappy allies we have. Anyway, but let me ask you about USMCA and whether you think that's a positive, and does it address some of the, in your view, the shortfalls from the original NAFTA agreement? Are you happy about this?
Yeah, I think it's fine. It's got some issues that we'll have to manage through. I'm just very glad that we're going to get this done. Yeah. Mexico agreed on the inspections for the factories. That's a positive. The one thing to keep our eye on, Joe, that we haven't talked a lot about is the dispute settlement mechanism. That's been watered down substantially, and it's been taken away for manufacturers. So it's only there for extractive industries, oil, mining. But Mexico and Canada, because they're members of TPP, they have access to the TPP dispute settlement mechanism. That's one thing that isn't being talked about, that is out there, that I wish could be a bit different, that our companies had more protection. The auto agreements are going to be very hard to manage, 75% from inside the region, this 40% with $16 an hour wages. It's going to be tough to manage, but we have an agreement. It's a good agreement. The estimate is that it will generate 800,000 jobs in the U.S., $65 billion of an additional GDP. Let's take it. Let's move on.
But overall, all right, good. So that's it's the enemy of the good and enemy of the perfect, and all, whatever that expression is. It's good enough to at least ratify and be happy about it. And it improves on some things. So that's good.
Yeah. And I think it's good to get that out of the way. It's good to get the uncertainty out of the way. But on China, this is going to be around for a long time. And, you know, will the agreement on structural issues contain anything regarding state-owned enterprises? And if it doesn't, do we accept it? And by accepting it, does that mean that we have accepted that we have two systems that are going to have to coexist? Those are the big strategic issues that I think are so much bigger than how much are they going to buy.
Would you agree that this is something that we've been on a collision course with them for some time? I mean, we are two different systems. They have operated kind of along parallel paths, but maybe this was an inevitable point. Yeah,
I do agree that we were heading towards something like this, maybe not to this scope. I mean, we've always had our issues with China. We've always had some very difficult negotiations, and every administration has made its own progress gradually. But this is, as you say, there's so much to unwind, whether it's CFIUS, whether it's export controls. And you know, we'll tell China don't use technology transfer. They'll say, well, then sell it to me instead of putting on export controls. It is just one vicious cycle. I will say this, Becky and Joe, I don't believe, as some people in the administration believe, that war with China is inevitable. And I think it's a very dangerous assumption, very dangerous to believe that that is the future, because we can just make it happen by insisting.
You mean a trade war?
No. I think there are people in the administration who believe that a conflict between China and the U.S., military, trade,
Mr.
economic.
Secretary, can you name some names here? Help us understand what you're talking about.
Well, just look at some of the books that have been written about China and the U.S. You've had people on your show. You had some yesterday.
Yeah, he's not
Bannon. Look,
there's been all sorts of people who think that over time we are headed towards some kind of
I think that's a mistake.
Genuine conflict. I don't disagree with that idea. The idea of an outright war, I think, to the degree there's speculation about that, though, I'm not sure. I mean, unless you're referring to Peter Navarro, I don't know.
He's talking about Bannon.
There's Navarro, Bannon. They believe that a military war eventually is inevitable. By calling China a strategic rival, I mean, they're a rival. There's no question. They're a competitor. But if they're strategic, that means that we believe that they're an existential threat. And if you call someone an enemy, they will become your enemy. So we need to be careful. And I hope that at this point, we keep the war in the confines of economics and the confines of trade. But this could get out of hand so easily. And yes, there are people who I believe just see that in the future it is inevitable that we are headed toward conflict. I think that's a dangerous assumption.
Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that people don't hate you, though. Don't forget that. So, I mean, China is doing some things in the South China Sea militarily, but we still have MAD, don't we? I mean, we'll obliterate each other 100 times over. We can't do that.
Well, you've seen the trade war is the same thing. We're both hurting each other. Who won?
Yeah.
Secretary Gutierrez, thank you for your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you.